enthusiasm and treatment. Brooke grew up in Montgomery County, attending Whitman High School. Mark Korman was first elected to the Maryland House of Delegates in 2014. Among his leadership positions from 2018 to 2022, Mark served as chair of the 24-member Montgomery County House delegation. In 2023, Mark was named House Majority Leader, and he was also named chair of the Environment and Transportation Committee, one of just 6 standing committees in the House. He'll retain that position in the upcoming session. Mark was born and raised in Montgomery County, and he attended Richard Montgomery High School. So I want to thank you both for joining us tonight for what I trust will be an interesting and informative discussion. And what I want to do is start with an opening question for each of our presenters. First, Brooke, you described the Comptroller's role as providing an independent view of our economy through your work and oversight of revenues. You both give the estimate of how much to spend and balance the books at the very end. Now, we've heard a lot about the state's deficit. What is your estimate of what we have to spend?
Good evening. It's great to be here with all of you. Margaret, thanks so much for that question. I actually prepared a little bit of a slide presentation because I sort of thought that's what folks were asking for, but to talk a little bit about our role in this process, because I think it's really exciting that you are delving into what the budget process looked like and what it means for Maryland and where we are. And it's, of course, great to be on with Delegate Korman. I see Delegate Wu. I'm sure there are others who I can't see right now. And I should add, I'm coming to you live from District 16 in the basement of my brother's house. So if you see a little girl run in, it's my niece. But thank you so much for inviting me tonight. If it's okay with you, would love to sort of walk you through a little bit of the budgetary process, and then happy to turn it over to Delegate Korman, and open it up for questions. Does that make sense? Is that okay? Great. So Michael on my team is going to share a few slides. So I do this because I think there's a lot of the budget process is complicated, and it's complicated for everybody. Even legislators, sometimes we all have to remind each other about where things are and who goes first. So I thought it would be helpful to just ground us by talking about what the role each person has in setting the budget and where we are today. So Michael, do you want to flip through a couple slides? Okay, keep going, and we'll just get through those since you want to jump right in. So, the Maryland's budget process. So, the governor has to submit a balanced operating budget to the General Assembly, but that's not actually where things start. They start with the Board of Revenue Estimates. The Board of Revenue Estimates includes me, I'm the chair, the treasurer, our Secretary of DBM, and the Director of the Bureau of Revenue Estimates. It's always hard when two different bodies have the same acronym. So the Bureau of Revenue Estimates is one of the divisions of the Office of the Comptroller. And that is the team that really works to understand the economic trends that are driving our state's economic performance, where our revenues are coming from, and the possible impacts that budget proposals could have on fellow Marylanders, and even fiscal notes for some bills that are presented. So the the Board of Revenue Estimates meets 3 times a year, in March, in September, and in December. And at those BRE meetings, we have a best practice approach. We have a consensus model approach where we adopt a revenue estimate for the state. And it is that revenue estimate that is then used by the governor and the General Assembly to set their budget. So we, in December, set our revenue estimate for the general fund, I should say. It's not even for the entire budget, it's just for the general fund that Maryland uses. Then the governor uses that estimate to transmit or to create balanced operating budget, and then transmits that to the General Assembly through really detailed budget books, a budget highlights volume, an operating budget bill, which contains every agency's appropriations, standard budget language, and of course, a summary of everything as well. Next slide. Um, at that point, Michael, sorry, next slide. Are you guys seeing it move? No. There we go. Okay. So after that, and this is Delegate Korman is very familiar with this process because he served on the Appropriations Committee, and we actually served on it together for a number of years. Once that budget bill is introduced, it enters legislative review. And this is really the time that everybody has to start understanding what the budget means for Maryland. The Department of Legislative Services will work with the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Budget and Taxation Committee to go through each of the agency operating budgets and their capital budgets, and we'll have hearings on all of those budgets. You know, one thing I do think it's important to remember, this doesn't come up a lot, but you can go to a budget hearing. So if you are really interested in making sure that the Maryland Department of the Environment gets funding for a certain program, you can go to that hearing and offer testimony in support of a certain piece of funding that they have, or oppose it. You can come to the Comptroller of Maryland's budget hearing and talk about how important it is to give us a big budget so that we can answer the phones and bring in the revenue. So takes up a big chunk of session. And then the General Assembly now has the ability, this is new, just a few years now, the General Assembly can make changes, can amend the operating budget and the capital budget, which it's always been able to use. So can decide what it would like to change throughout that process. Then both houses have to pass that bill, and now it goes back to the governor for signature as well. So that's the process, and I think it's just important to understand where advocacy can exist within that process and who is holding the bill at any time. So next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit too about where we are in our economy. We will get our job numbers tomorrow, is the first thing I will say. Every month we hold our breath a little bit for the job numbers when they come out from the Bureau of Legislative Statistics, our federal agency. We have not had our complete job numbers report in several months because of the federal shutdown. So these job numbers they will tell us a lot about what the effect of what has been happening at the federal government is going to mean for Maryland's economic picture moving forward. And of course, I hope that it's contained to just federal government employees. But I know that there are going to be some things to keep an eye on in what we see tomorrow. But this position really lends me a unique perspective into our economy, one that shows our state really navigating a period of economic uncertainty that I think, will be challenging, and we will have to build up more economic resilience. So despite that uncertainty, at our December 12th Board of Revenue Estimates meeting, our forecast remained largely unchanged from our September projections. And that's a really good sign. It's a sign that illustrates the power of our strong forecasting and our prudent fiscal stewardship from the governor, from our General Assembly. But it's also important to remember that there are forces that we can't always see in the revenue numbers that come in. So for instance, even though our revenue numbers remained relatively stable, and our revenue comes from our income tax, our sales tax, and our corporate income tax. Those are the three largest sources of income for the Maryland State Government General Fund. Although those revenues have been staying steady, there is a little bit of a disconnect because we do believe we're living in sort of this K-shaped economy where wealthier households and businesses are doing better, right? That's the K going up. And folks who don't have an investment portfolio, don't own their house, they're lagging further and further behind. Our large population of higher income households are spending quite freely, benefiting from high value assets like their homes and investments, paying taxes on capital gains. their spending and income mask the fact that individuals on that downward leg of the K are struggling, right? We see this in our agency from decreasing revenue for our supermarkets and restaurants. Especially, I'll say it's interesting if you dig into the numbers. Our supermarkets, food has stayed steady, but prepared food has gone down because people are not spending as much on prepared food. They're buying the basics. Restaurants that do not have a liquor license are doing significantly worse than restaurants that do have a liquor license. So that's like a Chipotle is not doing as well as a sort of high-end restaurant that sells wine. Um, and we see it in rising housing costs, which of course are the largest component of many Marylanders' budget. Um, I think just something to keep in mind about where we are in terms of our economy, and of course, a rising cost of living in the state. Next slide. So in Maryland, we have a state with a high median income, more than $109,000. But we still know that about 39% of households are struggling to afford basic necessities. I know that some of you have been on my talks before where we talked about federal spending in Maryland. As of FY24, about $150 billion came into Maryland from the federal government. And so I think one of the things we'll see tomorrow is that wage income piece. If you see on this in this box, the wage income piece, one of the things that we're keeping an eye on is if there are more and more cuts to federal employees, and those start actually exhibiting themselves in the Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers, then we believe that the revenue numbers will probably not be too far behind. We haven't seen it yet in our revenue numbers, but it may be coming. So next slide. Um, is that it? Michael? Sorry. Michael? Okay. We don't need to go through this since we're just talking about the budget. But so these are, you can take it down now, Michael. But though I just wanted to ground all of us with some data and numbers on where we are and what the budget process is as we're going through all of this. So hopefully that was a helpful overview. Not everybody knows how the comptroller fits into things, and what the budget process actually looks like, or the points when you can advocate and make your concerns and beliefs known. So wanted to just kick us off with that, and I'll turn it back over to you. Thanks.
So I do want to follow up, and maybe this isn't a good question to ask, but I'd said, what is your estimate of our spending position? And that was embedded in what you had there. But how does that relate to what we keep hearing about in terms of a deficit?
Sure. And Delegate Korman can take this too very easily. So we every year pass a balanced budget, right? Maryland has to pass a balanced budget. We're constitutionally mandated to. We don't get to print money like the federal government. The deficit comes into play because of ongoing spending. So every year we pass a balanced budget, but then perhaps costs come in higher. Maybe we budgeted $10 million for a new IT system, but the actual cost of it was $15 million. Or if you look at the long-term structural deficit, that means looking in the out years, are what we are statutorily mandated, like in law mandated to spend over the long term, is not projected to keep up with how quickly our revenues are growing. So it looks like this, right? So the deficit itself comes into play when we see that what we are needing to spend to meet the statutory requirements ends up costing more than we believe that we're going to bring in. Delegate Korman, I'm happy to turn it over to you. You'll probably say that much more artfully.
I doubt it, but I'll let WDC drive.
Well, just picking up on that, I mean, given what we're looking at in terms of what I kept hearing in the last session is stresses that limited what kind of spending could happen. Where are we now? As we're going into the session, there's a lot of concern that we won't be able to meet priorities that we have for spending. things that we want to ask for that we think we need. What are those constraints? Are we going to hear we can't spend anything? We're cutting back. Don't ask. Where are we in this budgetary process? Because it was very tough last session.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you for doing this program. I think, we talk about the budget, and we talk about a lot of wonky numbers, but really the budget is public education, right? That's 25% of our state budget. It's healthcare. That's 35% of our state budget. This probably appeals only to me, but it's transportation. It's about 10% of our state budget, right? So it's really all the things that we want our government to do when we talk about the budget. So it's really great that you all are recognizing the importance of this. Obviously, it's great to be with my former colleague, Comptroller Lierman. We were backbenchers together on the Appropriations Committee. Now she's like in charge of the state budget, and I'm not even on the Appropriations Committee, so I'm like less than a backbencher on budget issues. So it's great to be with her. And I just want to acknowledge Delegate Wu, but I see Delegate Warman, Delegate Solomon. I think here to intimidate anybody talking about the budget is former Delegate and Treasurer Nancy Kopp and former Delegate Brito. And I know a lot of aspiring council members, sheriffs, and delegates as well. So it's good to be with you. The bottom line number, Margaret, is about $1.5 billion. That's the projected structural deficit for the next fiscal year. So what does that mean? That's the budget that will start next summer that we'll be working on starting really next week. And one of the challenges is if you look at the future years, as the comptroller was describing, it just gets worse. So it's not a one-year problem. It's not even just a Donald Trump federal government problem, although that's contributing to the challenge. The problem is bigger than that. And if you look in sort of the 4 or 5 year range, it grows to $3 to $4 billion every year in the projection of what we would spend versus what we have. Now, as the comptroller explained, we never get to that imbalance because we have to balance our budget every year. Now, if this sounds really familiar, it's because we dealt with something similar last year, and we did it in a pretty, frankly, hard way. We did a lot of tax and fee increases and changes, and although we tried to target those towards the wealthiest with the income tax, there were lots of fees and other things that were more regressive that affect lots of working people. And we did a lot of cuts. And when we left the legislative session, I think we thought we were in pretty good stead for this coming year. And unfortunately, as the numbers came in, the story of Maryland, as the comptroller reads it to us, it did not look as good as we had hoped. And there are a couple of big reasons for that. One is the federal budget reconciliation bill. I'm not even going to use its stupid name that the president has branded it, but the federal reconciliation bill has really wonky effects on Maryland's tax revenue that the comptroller can describe far better than me, but it basically reduces the amount of revenue the state collects in state tax revenue for various wonky reasons. That's a huge contributor to the projected deficit for this coming budget year. And then the other thing, which is really quite concerning to me, is our state agencies are asking for really large, what are called deficiency appropriations. They're basically saying, this is a hypothetical number, we asked for $5 million last year, but we really spent $10 million. So now you have to budget that $5 million that we overspent. And if that happens on a one-off basis for some articulable reason, it's okay. If it happens consistently, that's a huge problem. And unfortunately, it's the latter. It's happening consistently. So those are the two big drivers of our immediate this year budget challenge, along with just a soft economy, as the comptroller was describing. The long-term challenges are kind of twofold. One is the soft economy, which, again, the comptroller can talk about more than I can, but is an interesting topic, and it was a problem even before the federal changes. The federal changes are really exacerbating that. And the other big driver is we have big ambitions. There's a lot of things we want to spend money on and invest in. And a big one that I know a lot of you have been involved in advocating for is the blueprint for Maryland's future, which is just Annapolis speak for how we spend money on public education, right? People imagine that the blueprint is some add-on. No, that is our state commitment to public education. That's over $1 billion to Montgomery County, for example, every year out of state coffers to fund public education. So when you look at what's driving our future deficits, it's a soft economy, revenue not coming in as high as we want, and it's really big commitments we've made and things we want to do. The blueprint chief among them, but there are many other examples of commitments we've made because those are things we want to do. So that's what we're facing. And unfortunately, it is going to be for advocates a little like last year in terms of our inability to to make big new investments, and frankly, figure out how we're going to keep the investments we have. We're looking at a $1.5 billion deficit, right? So just to give you a sense of what you might have to do to fill that hole, let's say we got rid of Boost, which was Governor Hogan's let's use public dollars for private schools, right? That's only $9 million, right? And by the way, that's taking kids who are currently in a school and saying you can't go there anymore, at least not with state dollars. That's $9 million. Let's say we got rid of COLAs, cost of living adjustments for all state employees. That's about $100 million, right? So it gets pretty sticky pretty quick when you realize how many of those kinds of cuts you have to take to get to 1.5 billion. I'll give you one more example. Let's say we don't further expand pre-K the way we hope to do under the blueprint. That saves about $66 million next year. So that's a lot of things like that that we're going to have to do to make this all work. So that was a really long answer. The short answer is 1.5 billion.
I appreciate the long answer because, it touched on a number of things that I know folks are concerned about. I don't want to take up any more with my questions. I know we have people going in the Q&A, and I wanted to just remind folks that are posting a few questions to the chat that those should go in the Q&A if you want to get them to our speakers. And so I'm now going to turn it over to Michael Baird to start getting the questions to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to stay, you guys don't need to see me while I do this. The two questions that have come into the chat so far have actually already been in the chat. So you guys probably have already been able to see them. So I think we'll probably start with the first one. Give me 1 second. The first question is, what is the likelihood that there will be support for a P3 for 495 in the bridge? Probably more geared towards the delegate, but
so I can take a crack at this. Although I have to say, voting on a P3 is actually the responsibility of the Comptroller and the Board of Public Works, and not the state legislature. I'll just briefly give a little background about where this project is. I know a lot of you know about the American Legion Bridge, I-270, I-495. This was a Governor Hogan priority for a number of years. He wanted to do one of these public-private partnerships to expand the roadway with toll lanes. Whatever you think of the specifics of the project, within about 10 years, we have to do something about the American Legion Bridge. We either need to spend significant funding refurbishing it, or we need to replace it just as a matter of safety. So something kind of has to happen within the next 10 years. Governor Moore, frankly, has kind of continued the project that Governor Hogan started. He's got his own kind of spin on it, but he has been seeking federal funding to support a very similar footprint project. And thus far, the federal government has not come through with that money. Between us friends here, I had heard early in the current federal administration that they were really interested in the project because it already has environmental approvals. And as any of you have read Abundance or Why Nothing Works or all these other books in the Democratic Party zeitgeist right now, environmental review is a huge part of any project. It's a very lengthy part of any project. And so they were looking for things that were done with environmental review so this guy could cut ribbons before he, knock on wood, leaves office someday. Instead of stepping forward with any kind of money, though, to actually make that happen, they released a request for information the other day, the federal government, asking for people to just submit their brilliant ideas about how to do this project. So I don't quite know what the point of that is. They have no authority to do anything like that. The most effective way, if they wanted to move something forward, would be to bring a check, which they haven't done. So that's sort of the overall status of the project. I have heard mixed things about whether the Moore administration wants to use a public-private partnership or a more traditional approach to the project. We could probably have a long discussion about what the pluses and minuses are of those, and I don't know if the Comptroller wants to add anything.
Yeah, thank you, Delegate. I'll say, I've been pretty outspoken about my skepticism of P3s for long-term transportation projects. I have a lot of concerns about the risk to taxpayers, to all of us, when we use a long-term P3 model. And so it would take a lot for me. I would have to see a lot to overcome that skepticism. And I have not been engaged at all by the Moore administration and MDOT in talking about this issue yet. It has not come up at all in any of our conversations. So totally something has to be done at some point. And I think but I do not have any other information right now about what is being proposed.
All right. All right. So our next question is, sorry, by how much will the steadily decreasing federal funding increase the projected $1.5 billion deficit? And how much of the deficit is related to programs that were funded by the now extinct COVID funds? I think that's probably a two-parter or two-parter about the delegate and the comptrollers.
That's a good question. Yeah. So when we look at how much the federal government means to the economy of Maryland, some of that comes in, fairly directly as revenue that we then would have to spend, in any way. So wages, right? Those result in withholding that comes to us. Contractors, also, a huge 10% of our GDP is federal contracting. And so there's a huge piece that ends up with contractors who they have income, sometimes they pay corporate income tax, sometimes they end up paying withholding tax, others. So there's a lot of different ways. And then there's just federal grants, right? Federal grants come to Maryland to pay for foster care youth, or for transportation projects, or for a bevy of different things. One of the ones early on that was cut was the BRIC grant, BRIC. I can't remember what it stands for, which is why I'm using the acronym, but it is about helping to make sure we're shoring up our vulnerable areas for climate change. So down on the Eastern Shore, they lost this really important grant that they had counted on to help revitalize and create a more resilient shoreline. So that is, they affect our revenues in all different ways, right? Federal grants goes directly to a program. The wages come directly to revenue. Contracts generates sales and tax use. Generates corporate income tax, generates withholding revenue. So every piece of that contributes to somehow to money that we have to spend at the state level, but every piece is different. So there's not sort of an easy answer to by how much will the steadily decreasing federal funding increase the projected deficit, because that decreasing federal funding will hit our budget in many different ways. I hope that makes sense.
And I can grab onto the other part of the question. Clearly, the infusion of federal aid during COVID was incredibly helpful to our state economy, our state's people, and our state budget. Most of the money, not all, but most of the money we tried to use for one-time uses, however. We did not create a ton of new programs because we knew that money was temporary. So, for example, the biggest thing we did with the money was we put it in a savings account called the Blueprint Fund and paid for public education out of that. So in fact, if we did not have that money, the projected deficit would be far worse because we would already be doing sort of pay-as-you-go spending on our pre-K through 12 education program, but we're actually still drawing down that savings we put away during COVID. We did a lot of capital construction projects. Now, there might be some ongoing cost to a new building, but the big money is in the actual construction of the building. But there were a few things we did do in hopes that we'd be able in the future to continue funding them. For example, we did an add-on dental benefit for Medicaid, something I think a lot of us probably think is a good idea and would support, and want to see people who are in need have healthy teeth and get dental care, but it is an ongoing cost. But most of the funding from COVID we put towards one-time uses or savings. Our rainy day fund is still today, even after a few years of drawdowns, higher than it was in the entire time Comptroller Lierman and I were on the Appropriations Committee together, where it used to be around 5 or 6% of general fund revenue. Now I think it's around 10% of general fund revenue. So there's been a lot of savings as a result of the COVID dollars that we're still benefiting.
Yep.
Thank you. So our next question is, when funding the blueprint, do you anticipate cutting back on certain areas such as school coordinators?
So this is where the comptroller says she's not the policymaker; she just counts the money, right? So,
sorry.
So there's no firm answer here yet, but I think why do Bonnie and Clyde rob banks? Because that's where the money is, right? And so, to be honest, when you're looking, forget the deficit this coming year. When you're looking at a 5-year budget window with a $4 billion deficit in the out years, there's no question that part of the discussion is going to be on the education spending side and figuring out what it makes sense to prioritize and what it makes sense to pull back on. Now, the blueprint was actually built for that, right? Like that's the reason we have the Accountability and Implementation Board. That's the reason we have these periodic check-ins. That's the reason we have all the reporting to understand what's working and what's not and make adjustments. Sometimes we're going to have to make adjustments beyond what I think any of us probably would want because of the realities of our budget. And as the Comptroller said, we can't print our own money. We don't have our own central bank. But a lot of it can be informed by the data and what's working and what isn't. There were a lot of great ideas in the blueprint, right? There's also a lot of things we realized we had to do relatively quickly in the blueprint's implementation that the blueprint never thought about, right? Because of COVID in particular, the need for technology, the need for extra tutoring, all sorts of things. And so there are going to have to be some adjustments in the future. I don't know if that'll be this legislative session, but certainly in the next few legislative sessions to adjust the reality of where our budget is, but also the reality of how the blueprint is working. And again, that is a feature, not a bug of the blueprint. The blueprint had these accountability implementation processes put in it for exactly this reason.
Thank you. Our next question, if I can find it, I lost it. Comptroller, approximately where is the household income inflection point in the K for the vacation economy?
There isn't sort of a set inflection point that we could name. It has more to do with on the personal income side with, do you own your own home? Do you have investments? The stock market's been growing quite a bit. So it's really about where your wealth is, because that's what's determining whether it's growing. On the business side, there's actually, you could argue, a little bit of a K-shaped economy in businesses as well, where, in businesses that are involved in sort of the AI bubble. I mean, I'll call it a bubble. I don't know if it's officially a bubble, but the AI work, like they are growing, right? So much faster and then we have some other businesses, the restaurants, some small retailers who are struggling more. So it's a divide that we see sort of in both personal finances and in business. So, but there isn't a sort of here, if you make more than $200,000 a year, you're doing fine. And if you make less, you're not doing well. It doesn't really exist like that. Michael? Yes, next question.
Maybe I can cue. I see a question in the comments, and maybe I can go to that while Michael looks at the next. But it says, my question is why Maryland, especially PG and Montgomery County, are so resistant to development. Developments are steering away from Maryland due to unreasonable regulations, which is reducing growth and revenue. Help me understand why Maryland does not follow the Northern Virginia approach. Do you want to take a crack at that?
I am not gonna sort of say why things are as they are, but what I will say is that we spent about 6 months talking to advocates, local government officials, nonprofit, for-profit developers, and more, and put together a very comprehensive and first of its kind report on housing and the economy in Maryland, talking through domestic migration, looking at where people in Maryland are moving to because housing has become unaffordable, and looking at supply and demand and the factors that are impacting supply and prices. The cost to build housing is at historic highs. The cost of materials and labors has increased, but also regulation adds a big percent to the price as well. So I just would ask and hope that if you're interested in this, you'll take a look at our reports. I linked to all our research reports there, and you can scroll down to find our housing report and even just the 2-page excerpt as well.
And I'll just add, I think you'll see, like the governor announced today, support for a bill focused on several housing bills, but one in particular focused on transit-oriented development that I think makes a lot of sense for places not only like Montgomery and Prince George's County, but also if you go to Baltimore County and Anne Arundel County, they have like no development over their light rail stations. They have no development over their subway stations, unlike Montgomery and Prince George's in Baltimore City. And so it'd be good to see some growth over transit in those places, similar to what we have in places like Friendship Heights or Bethesda or Silver Spring, where we really focused growth on those areas.
Michael's having some technical difficulties. He can't hear us. So I'm going to ask the next question. Going from David Naiman. My question is whether there are any remaining revenue options after last year, and if there's a reluctance to raise revenue in an election year. It seems like you have a, quote, choice between painful cuts or painful revenue raisers.
I guess it's a policymaker question, Comptroller. Yeah, look, I think there are revenue options, but there is a tipping point, right? I mean, you can only go so far in pushing on the tax side before it does have an effect on the economy. I think there's a number of places you could go. I don't think the reluctance is just because of an election year, although clearly election year politics do affect our behavior. I think the reluctance is we're already a relatively high tax state. We made some tax changes 9 months ago, and it's just hard to keep going to the well again and again and again. And the future options are much harder hitting on more people. So, for example, our sales tax is 6%. It's been that way since 2007. I think you get $1 billion, Comptroller, if you add a penny to the sales tax. That is an obvious place to go for revenue because lots of other jurisdictions have sales tax at that level. Lots of jurisdictions have local sales taxes on top of a statewide sales tax. We don't have that. Of course, we do have a local piggyback income tax, but it's very regressive and will hit people hard. Another issue is that our sales tax revenue, other than a little change we made last year on IT services, is entirely geared towards physical goods, which had a little bit of a comeback during COVID, but generally more of our economy is services now than goods. And so one thought for the future is to shift our sales tax to focus on more of the services. But again, that hits a lot of people and can have some pretty negative effects. So we just need to sort of balance what's the sort of benefit of raising revenue to pay for programs that are important versus the real, pocketbook, checkbook impact that'll have on families that, we want to make sure have a little extra money, at the end of the year to buy their kids holiday presents.
It's Mark. Okay, thank you. We've heard about Maryland's continuing soft economy issue with the pile-on of reductions in income from federal job losses and contracting jobs. What strategies do you see on the horizon for addressing that soft economy to increase the tax base? What is a realistic timeline for juicing our economy and revenue streams?
I don't know that there is that's a difficult question. I don't think there's one answer for, here's the timeline to, if we just do X in 2 years, we'll have created, thousands of jobs. That's not exactly how the economy works. If it was, then we would be doing those things. So what we do need to do is look at, which industries we have a comparative advantage in. And the governor has named sort of lighthouse industries that he believes Maryland has an advantage in and where we should be investing because those industries will help drive future job growth. Quantum, aerospace, biotech are the, some of the things that he has named, a few of the ones that he's named. And so those are ones where the General Assembly and the governor, like through their budgeting process, have, sort of put the gauntlet down and said, we're going to invest in these industries because we think that we have an advantage here and those industries are going to grow and create jobs and help fuel their own sort of sub-economies around these projects or around these sectors. So there's not a core timeline to that because they all grow at a different rate. But I think it's that kind of dedicated investment and sort of saying where we want to grow and being decisive about it and then following up for a number of years. It'll take that to make sure that we're moving away from our over-reliance on federal government jobs and moving more towards the private sector.
And the lighthouse industry is obviously a great thing. It plays off of our federal strengths, which are still strengths. I mean, they are tarnished jewels to be sure, but I would still rather have the NIH in my district, my county, and my state than not have it. Same with FDA over in District 20 and National Institutes of Science and Technology in District 17. But there's lots of other things we can do. Actually, the Comptroller and I have worked together on how we regulate franchises in the state of Maryland, which is a big small business growth model. You don't need your own idea. You basically lease one from a franchisor. We have both franchisors and franchisees in the state of Maryland. It's a really important part of our economy. We also have one of the worst laws for franchisors and franchisees in Maryland, their ability to access this model that we've been working to try to fix with some limited success so far, but more to come. And then the governor did something I think was really important last year, which is he set up a permitting review council to try to figure out how to make permitting work better and more smoothly in the state of Maryland for projects, for businesses. Right now, it is focused on the state level, but it really needs to also reach into the local level and the interplay of state and local permits. The notorious example I like to give is that the Maryland Transit Administration, a state agency, spent several years trying to get permits from the Maryland Department of the Environment, another state agency, to build the Purple Line. So if a state agency is having trouble getting permits from another state agency for a tens of billions of dollars project, what hope is there for the small business trying to open in downtown Bethesda to get the permits they need? And so this permitting council is trying to cut through a lot of that siloing of the departments and try to improve that situation. And if you're really interested, we're going to have a hearing on this in the Environment and Transportation Committee at the end of January with members of that council, including its chair, who's the Secretary of Planning. So lots of other opportunities like that. But there's, I think, 50,000. If I read the Comptroller's report right, there's 50,000 federal positions in Montgomery County, and then 50,000 Montgomery County residents who have federal jobs. It's not a one-to-one match, right? You're allowed to live in Montgomery County, but work at the Housing and Urban Development Department in DC, right? There is no one solution that's going to replace that, right? There's no one thing that can come in and pick up all that slack. So it's going to require a lot of these smaller things working together.
Thank you.
So,
go ahead.
So we have a question here. When we cut funds for childcare or cap spending on childcare scholarships, fewer caregivers work or work fewer hours, leading to lower revenue and higher reliance on social services. Cuts like this are incredibly short-sighted. How do we start thinking long-term when the budget has to be balanced annually? Delegate Korman.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a huge challenge. Like, we just don't have the ability to say we're going to spend, $30 million more dollars a year on childcare scholarships year after year, knowing that in year 10, right, that's going to have a real big payoff. And you can find that with lots of other programs where we know there would be some long-term benefit if we could just sort of, get through it. And we just don't have that luxury, unfortunately. I will say we did a lot on the childcare scholarship and expanding access to it over the past few years. We have sort of closed it off now, but we've closed it off at that higher level, right? It's just not expanding further, but we closed it off at that higher level. And so hopefully we will see some of the benefit you're describing. But yeah, when you're talking about childcare, healthcare, public education, all of these things, we know if we just spent a little bit more up front, they could have really great long-term benefits. But unlike our federal friends, I guess they used to be our friends, our federal whatever's down the street, we don't have the ability to kind of manipulate the numbers the way they do. And I see the question also asked about combined reporting for businesses and revenue, as a revenue raiser. And I'll just note the House, even I think when the Comptroller was there, has voted for combined reporting multiple times. The Senate has not gone along. One thing the Senate did do this year, it's not specific to business, but it is specific to our highest earners, is support a capital gains surcharge on our highest earners to at least do some progressive taxation to try to fund some of our needs.
I want to go back up and you can see the questions too, I believe. Who is responsible for assuring taxpayer dollars are appropriately used to achieve intended objectives for targeted audiences? And they refer to DPSCS, proposed $1 billion treatment facility in Baltimore to the exclusion of capital project needs of 18 Maryland state prisons.
I mean, I think that's ultimately a question for voters, because voters elect representatives and the governor and me. But the governor, this is all done through the budget. So the budget is our biggest bill every year, right? It in fact is the only bill that the General Assembly and governor are required to pass every year is the budget bill. And so that budget bill is where operating budget bill, capital budget bill is where all of these projects are laid out. And so, for instance, if you are interested in advocating for those 18 Maryland state prisons, like if you are like, they need these fundings, we should not be, investing in this $1 billion treatment facility, then you have the opportunity to go and make your voice heard at the budget hearing on the DPSCS capital budget. But it is at the end of the day, if it comes to the governor, the General Assembly to write and to pass this budget bill, that, as I said earlier, the governor proposes it, the General Assembly has the ability now to amend. But at the end of the day, it's that budget document that's so important.
And I agree with all that. I think there are a few other, I'll say, work streams. We have the Office of Legislative Audits that audits agency spending. We have something called the Office of Program Assessment and Government Efficiency. I might be getting that acronym wrong, but they look at things on more of a performance basis. But they're relatively small, so they're not looking at every department every year. Same with our auditors. We also have, the Comptroller can talk more about this, the Board of Public Works, which for good or for ill, basically has to sign off on almost every dollar that our state spends. And so there's a lot of oversight opportunity there as well. But ultimately, I agree, it's the choice of the voters and how the how the budget is worked on.
So I have a question here. Our Lieutenant Governor Aruna Miller's professional experience is heavily rooted in transportation planning and engineering practice. Why is she not tasked with Route 270, Route 495, with the Route 270, 495 issue?
Question for the governor.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we'll leave it there. So there was another question. Why are state agencies overspending? And I know you spoke, Delegate Korman, about how the agency budgets come in. They'll get allocated $5 billion one year, and they'll spend an extra $5 million. Come in and say it's $10 million the following year, and that's not limited to one agency. What is going on with that?
Yeah, I think there's various interpretations. I think the one that concerns me the most, if it's accurate, and I think we don't have a good handle on this yet, and I'm hoping it's something that the legislature and the Department of Legislative Services can try to get a handle on by looking at the trends a little bit more. But my concern is that they are purposely understating their needs, that they know they have a higher need than what they are requesting because they know they can come back in later and fulfill that need. Now, fulfilling that need may be a good thing because that means someone is getting some services. So I don't want to say that we absolutely should not be spending this money, but that's just not a sustainable way to do business. If their costs are going to be X, we need to kind of know that, and then we can, make the decisions we need to make about how to find the revenue to do that. Now, I think it also depends on the agency, right? You can look at some agencies and see this happens year after year. I think I said this earlier. You can look at other agencies and see it happens once every 3 years. Well, that once every 3 years is because things happen sometimes, right? So if you take an economy going down and a social service, well, when the economy goes down, the demand for those services goes up, and that can be hard to predict, right? So that's there are things like that happen. I'm just concerned there's something more more repetitive going on that does need to be examined more closely.
I'll say
We
ask
go
for,
ahead.
I know we only have a couple minutes left, but we go through a pretty extensive budgeting process every year in my agency, and we submit a very detailed request to the governor, and we ask for what we need. We don't always get it. And so some things we just don't do because we don't have the budget for them. And other things, occasionally there have been things that we have had to do, whether it's because it's required by the federal government or some security issue came up and it was not budgeted. And so for those items in the past, we've had to request a deficiency. Now we have needed pretty small deficiencies. I don't even know if we needed one this year. So I'm glad about that. But certainly, I have always taken the position, I think it's really important to ask for what you need, so that we can be very transparent about what it takes to run these agencies. And I try to be transparent about what it takes to run my agency.
And just a quick follow-up on that, if you have something you're required to do and it's not budgeted for, you're asking for it, but it's not budgeted for, what do you do about that?
That's a good question. So I passed a bill to create an Office of Taxpayer Advocate several years ago. It's just one example. And in the bill, it said that our agency was to receive, I think it was three or four pins, which are, positions, to create this tiny but new Office of Taxpayer Advocate. Well, in our budget, we requested those pins, and in our budget, we didn't get any of them. But there was a law in the books that said I had to create this office, which I wanted to create too. So we had to just take pins from other divisions to create it. So that ended up being revenue neutral. It was fine, but it was fine for the deficiency. It was fine. I didn't need a deficiency, but it didn't, it didn't truly meet the spirit of the law. Different things happen, and I recognize fully that the Department of Budget and Management has a really challenging job. So this is, no shade on them. But it is, things come up sometimes, and we do the best we can with what we have.
I'm going to go to one last question. It's one that I missed earlier. It seems the data centers in Virginia are making them a ton of money in taxes. What do you think about them from Maryland? Brooke, can you take that one?
Sure. I mean, I'll say, as Delegate Korman wrote, there was just a study passed on data center impacts. And I think that is a really good idea and really important because there are a lot of look, we need data centers, right? Setting aside AI, we still need data centers throughout the country, including, we already have some data centers in Maryland. And so we do need some data centers. The question is how and where, and what does it mean? I think the study will be really important. It's important to keep in mind that data centers don't retain a lot of employees. So there's not like a lot of when we say Virginia has generated a ton of economic impact, if we look at the impact, it's construction, right? So it's the upfront, let's build the data center. There's very few jobs at the data center itself once they are constructed. However, one of the things that Virginia has done well with its data center universe is that companies who have their data near those data centers locate near the data centers. Their data is there and they want to be near their data. And so, actually, part of the reason that Virginia has had an economic boon around the data centers is because businesses have relocated to be near their data. And so, it's not just the data center itself in Virginia, it's often been the businesses that are there too. But I'm looking forward to the study and reviewing it and being helpful in any way that we can be.
I want to thank our speakers tonight. Mark, did you have a final comment you wanted to make? I didn't want to.
Nope, ditto the Comptroller.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been a great discussion. Really appreciate your coming out. We appreciate the questions that were raised by the audience. And Cynthia, did you have a final word you wanted to say to our participants and to our speakers?
I want to thank both of you. You are both stellar public servants, and you have answered so many questions from us tonight that we will take into consideration as we get ready to advocate in Annapolis. And please, everybody who's been on this call, consider signing up for Annapolis Day and coming with us on February 4th. Go to the website, you can find out more. Thank you very much, Brooke and Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone.